Good morning to the Columbia community and welcome to Alumni Talk, The Shape of Power, Race in American Sculpture. And we really appreciate you joining us today. My name is Riley Jones IV. I'm Columbia College class of 2017 and a member of the Columbia College Alumni Association, many of you know, CCAA. And I'm currently a member of the Intellectual Programming Committee, and so I'm really excited to kick off this Alumni Talk conversation. The CCAA seeks to represent the diversity and richness of alumni, always with a deep connection to current students. Through intellectual programming, networking, and community building, annual traditions that alumni can return to, and opportunities to lead and serve, the CCAA provides rich opportunities to stay involved, have an impact, and promote the success of Columbia College. This event in particular is presented to you by the CCAA and Columbia College Women. More about this afternoon's conversation. This is a virtual conversation exploring how American sculpture has shaped and been shaped by narratives of race, power, and national identity. Examining the themes of the Smithsonian American Art Museum exhibition, The Shape of Power, Stories of Race in American Sculpture, exhibition curator and art historian Karen Lemmey, Columbia College class of 1995, will be in conversation with the director of London's Public Gallery, Nicole Estilo Kaiser, Columbia College class of 2020. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Karen Lemmey CC’95 is the Lucy S. Rhame Curator of Sculpture at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She joined the museum staff in 2012 and is responsible for research, exhibitions, and acquisitions related to the museum's sculpture collection, the largest of American sculpture in the world. Lemmey is co-curator of the exhibition, The Shape of Power, Stories of Race and American Sculpture. She also developed exhibitions on Isamu Noguchi, CC 1926, Martin Puryear, Hiram Powers, and direct carving. Before joining the museum, Lemmey was a research associate at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Monuments Coordinator for New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation. She was an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellow at the New York Historical Association and an Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Lemmey earned a Bachelor's of Art History and holds a Doctorate in Art History and a Certificate in American Studies from the CUNY Graduate Center. She became interested in sculpture as a high school student while an apprentice at the studio of Greg Wyatt, CC '71, sculptor in residence at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine. Next, I'll introduce Nicole Estilo Kaiser CC’20, who is an art historian, art advisor, and director of the Public Gallery in East London, where she has curated numerous exhibitions, including Dottie Addy, 40 Years, the first UK solo exhibition and major retrospective of works by the AIR Gallery co-founder, and to supplement the fragment at Public Gallery, an exhibition dedicated to the writing and research of the late American art critic Craig Owens. She earned a master's in the history of art from the Courtauld Institute of Art, where she received high distinction for her dissertation, A Conjuring, an Exorcism, Cold War Ghosts, and the Work of Sung Tu, exploring hauntology, subject formation, and governance under the supervision of Clara Kemp Welch. Estilo Kaiser is pursuing a PhD at the University of Cambridge with Professor Amy Tobin, researching artistic responses to neoliberal systems from 1985 to present. Estilo Kaiser is also a patron to the Delfina Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to developing creative practice through residencies and public programming, and a trustee at Metroland Cultures, which works to support artists through studios and residency programs. She earned a Bachelor's of Art History and Women's Studies and sits on the Columbia College Women Board of Directors. We're extremely fortunate to have these two experts with us today. And so now I'll hand it over to Nicole and Karen. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Riley. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be speaking in conversation with Karen Lemmey about her exhibition, The Shape of Power, a major survey of American sculpture at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. To give a brief overview of the next 45 minutes, Karen will start us off with a short presentation, sharing with us key elements and considerations in the research and development of her exhibition. We'll then look at a handful of works included in the exhibition and through close reading and comparative study, consider how these works give form to some of the core ideas, questions, and objectives of The Shape of Power, namely how artists raise social or political critique, ask for change, contest the canon, or demonstrate forms of solidarity and community through sculpture. Finally, we'll end with a quick Q&A. So as Riley mentioned, please feel free to send us your thoughts and questions using the button at the bottom of your screen. Karen, I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Riley. I'm so grateful to join this conversation today. I was part of that team that organized the major exhibition about intersecting centuries-long histories of race and sculpture in the United States. It was a project that we worked on for about 8 years. I think our PowerPoint is about to load. You see the names of my 2 co-curators, Tobias Wofford and Grace Yasamura. And together we worked alongside museum educators, local university students, and an interdisciplinary team of scholars from around the country. The exhibition just closed in September. It ran for almost a year at our museum in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. The building is one that we share with the Portrait Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery. And perhaps some of you have visited this space. And it's here that I've been the curator of sculpture for 13 years. We have the largest collection of American sculpture. So while looking through this collection over my tenure, I was thinking about through lines in the collection, but also in the history of American sculpture more broadly. And I couldn't ignore the way that so many works functioned in this history of racialization through sculpture. And we know from scientists that race is not biological. In fact, the Human Genome Project verified that we're more than 99% genetically similar. Race is a social construct, but it's one that we all live with. And I started to wonder if we could use another cultural production, sculpture, to help us understand the construction of race in the United States. How does looking at sculpture influence the way we think about race? If we think about how the act of racializing a figure in sculpture, an inert piece of stone or bronze perhaps, could we be more aware of the instinct to racialize one another? So this exhibition, next slide, includes 82 works that range from monumental to pocket size, made by some 70 artists across 3 centuries. The oldest work in the show was George Washington's Peace Medal from the 18th century. And most recent, there was a work that literally came out of the kiln in 2023. We did not organize it chronologically because contemporary artists offer such incredible cultural critiques that it was really interesting to juxtapose the contemporary with the historical. And so we used thematic groupings to break down this list of 82 works. Next slide. And it's through this, here I'm just showing a glimpse across the checklist, but you'll see this extraordinary range, not only of materials and scale, but also the many ways in which figuration led to hierarchies, thinking about hierarchies of humans, classifications, privileging some, and othering and exoticizing others. And abstraction too is something that Nicole and I will get into later. So let's talk just for a moment about why sculpture. Sculpture is ubiquitous. It comes in many forms. It might be tiny. You see here on the upper right a coin, the so-called buffalo nickel. But sometimes it's monumental and towering over us, inspiring awe, or even provoking terror as we shrink in its shadow. Sculpture can have tremendous affect. It can appear incredibly lifelike, sometimes serving as a surrogate for an actual person, someone we might be voyeuristically observing in a way that we would not be permitted to in real life. Sculpture shares 3 dimensions with our bodies, and it makes us more sensorially aware, viscerally aware of ourselves and those around us. It can be really haptic. Most effective sculpture prompts us to want to touch it, to test out with our fingertips what we think we're seeing with our eyes, to verify the form and the texture. There is a reason, in fact, and I'm thinking back to Art Hum, how that civilizations are memorialized sometimes by their sculptural ruins. And it's even in these ruins and fragments that we sometimes gain a sense of the scope of the power of a fallen empire. Sculpture, I would argue, is a special medium, and it's in this context of the exhibition that we present it as an underutilized tool for examining the societal construction of race in the US, and when possible, a portal for conversations about race. So just to linger on this intersection of power, race, and sculpture, this example is prime. It's showing Lincoln's inauguration, and I've circled two sculptures: the Discovery of Columbus on the left by Luigi Persico, and Horatio Greeno's The Rescue on the right. Next slide. The rescue is also known as civilization. And for more than a century, until 1958, these sculptures bracketed every presidential inauguration with an unequivocal visual statement about manifest destiny. You see on the left a woman who's meant to be a Native American figure crouching in the shadow as Columbus holds aloft a globe. And on the right, you see Greeno's portrayal of a Native figure who's holding a tomahawk, and he's being arrested in the moment by a pioneer. And Greeno, the sculptor of the work on the right, was really direct in sharing his intentions. He said, quote, "Sculpture is meant to convey the idea of the triumph of the whites over the savage tribes." So despite the directness of his words and the prominence of these sculptures on the steps of the Capitol, this example is generally unfamiliar to most people. Despite this rising interest in our times around monuments, and we're certainly accustomed to seeing debates about monuments, especially Confederate ones, there is sort of less awareness of this history of sculpture. Next slide, please. And so too, it's not just the monumental that can be used to convey ideas about history or nationhood. Statecraft can fit in your pocket as we think about currency. Coins are often produced by sculptors, and this nickel was designed by James Earl Fraser, and it combined the features of three Native American models. The idealized portrait that shows in profile on the left, along with the bison on the coin's reverse, conjure a myth of an Old West as a place of the decimation of the bison, as well as indigenous people, as natural inevitabilities, rather than a consequence of strategies of removal. The nickel circulated in the palms of people's hands for about 25 years. Until 1938, insinuating this stereotyped head into the mundane purchases of a loaf of bread or a pocket full of candy. As Fraser himself said, the purpose was not to make a portrait, but a type. Here's a view of the exhibition showing a room that was very popular. It addressed the idea of home as the first classroom, the place where so many of us are introduced to the idea of race, where we formulate first impressions, learn words to describe ourselves and to describe others, words that are permitted, words that are forbidden. And in the cluttered coziness of this Victorian parlor, next slide, one sometimes encountered domestically scaled sculptures, such as those seen here, that are kind of swallowed up into that archival image that we included on the background wall. And these things were scaled and also marketed for the home. And many of them used racialized tropes and sentimentalized ideas about race. So I'm just showing for a moment this work on the right, John Rogers, The Wounded Scout, A Friend in the Swamp, which shows two figures. The one on the right is an African-American man self-emancipating. The work dates to the Civil War, and he's making his way through a swampy terrain barefoot as he escapes, and he's paused his journey to support a Civil War soldier, a Union soldier who's injured, perhaps mortally injured. He's wearing a tourniquet. And the question that I often asked audiences visiting the show was, who's the protagonist here? Because we might assume that the figure on the right is the lead character, let's say. He's alert, he's looking off in the distance, he's stronger, he's literally supporting the other figure. But in fact, the main actor, according to Roger's title, is the wounded scout. A friend in the swamp is the figure on the right, who's really meant to be subordinate, even though he's physically stronger. And Roger's arrangement appealed to his Northern abolitionist clients because it's a work that may celebrate emancipation, or at least be curious about emancipation, and yet it's reinforcing the racist social order of its day. It's a relationship that we also see a lot in American literature, as Toni Morrison has pointed out. She's noted, quote, the complementarity of a figure who can be assumed in some way, bound, fixed, unfree, and serviceable. And when I look at this sculpture, I always think about Percival Everett's recent novel, James, which gives a retelling of Huck Finn from the perspective of the enslaved character, Jim. But in sculpture, we have, next slide, cultural critics like Betty Saar, whose work in the show was the liberation of Aunt Jemima. And here she's taking another trope, the mammy, which had its origins in 19th century popular culture, and presenting her in 1972 armed and emblazoned with a Black Power fist and really ready to launch her own liberation. And I note too that during the course of the exhibition, Aunt Jemima was still appearing, in the course of preparing the exhibition, Aunt Jemima continued to appear on Pancake products as recently as 2021. And so, this is something that endured from the 19th century really up to just a moment ago. Saar's figure challenges the racist fantasy of subservience. Her figure is also referencing the vernacular, utilitarian, decorative things that are sculptural and that maybe populate places in domestic spaces. Each of us might infinitely add to this litany of examples from the monumental to the miniature in both public and domestic spheres. And next slide. Before I turn back to our conversation with Nicole, which I'm really looking forward to, I'm just going to leave you with one more example. This is also the sculpture that we chose for the cover of the catalog. And I think we'll add a link in the chat for how you might access the exhibition catalog. But the work is called Bridge, and it's by conceptual artist Glenn Kino. And the sculpture is an undulating multi-cast piece, which I'll show you in a moment, but it's referencing this important gesture, this moment in Mexico City in 1968, when Olympian gold medalist Tommie Smith, who you see in the center, made this gesture of raising his fist to protest racism while he stood on the medal's podium wearing the gold medal for the 200-meter dash that he had just won. And by his side are the other winning Olympians, and John Carlos also with his fist raised in the same protest. So next slide. 50 years later, Glenn Kino, who's a Japanese American artist in LA, created the sculpture Bridge by working with Smith and taking a body cast of his arm and kind of immortalizing that athlete's gesture many years later. And then I said he was a conceptual artist, so there's a lot of symbolism in the 200 casts of the arm referencing the 200-meter race. And this was a way of showing how sculpture too has evolved. It might refer to the figure without representing the whole figure. It might refer to the heroic without figuring an individual. And I think, the act of those Olympians was about a call to collective power. So it became such a fitting work to have on the cover of our exhibition catalog. And I think I have one more image just showing, yes, here we are at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, known as SAM for short. And you see Tommy Smith on the right with his wife, Delois, and the artist Glenn Kino on the left as we stand underneath this incredible sculpture. So I hope Nicole can turn on her camera and we can
Hi, I'm here.
have our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, for that lovely introduction. And I think, something it really reminds me is that sculpture truly does function, and that, looking is an active, decisive move. And so, I'm excited to kind of explore those ideas with you with the, works that we're going to discuss together. If we can go to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So I want to start by asking a question that you actually set out yourself in the introduction to your exhibition catalog. So the question is, how does the medium of sculpture give physical form to racist ideas, shaping how generations have learned to visualize and think about race? And I'd like to consider this question in the context of Malvina Hoffman's 1934 bronze sculpture that you included in the exhibition.
Yes, thank you for that. So this is a work that it's a reduction actually of life-size bronzes, a really ambitious commission. And there were over 100 of them that the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, so a science museum, commissioning an artist, Malvina Hoffman, who was American but lived in Paris and even studied with Rodin. She wins this commission in 1929. Eugenics are very much being discussed as a prominent, kind of dominant idea. Some scientists are refuting the science, quote unquote, behind it. I mean, it was proved, of course, a total fallacy. But in that moment, they wanted Hoffman to enliven the anthropology display at the museum by relying on the likeness, the seductiveness of these bronzes that she produced. So in our exhibition, we showed a work that's in our collection. It's a reduction from that the life-size edition. And I think next slide, we might see yes, here's the image, the archival image showing the hall with all of these works. And the one that is in our collection is the Solomon Islander climbing a palm tree. She's really, she's basing her sculptures on lifelike observations, sometimes visiting places, but sometimes just kind of extrapolating. She would also go to the Colonial Fair in Paris and find models that she thought were interesting. She's using calipers to measure people, which is something that artists often do. But in this commission, she's doing it under the guise of anthropometry, the measurement of skulls, as a way of thinking about race as something biological, which we know to be false. So, I think the likeness of her sculptures and the sort of art interest, the material interest of the bronze is something that we are asking in this exhibition, like, how does that influence the way people thinking about this myth of biological race, right? If something looks so lifelike and it looks so visually interesting, is it somehow verifying this false idea about biological race?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. This question of, again, like bronze sculpture, or of course the map, which is maybe, if we go back to the previous slide, also something you included in the materials contextualizing this work in your exhibition, thinking about how visual culture translates ideas more than it may actually, as we know, Hoffman took serious artistic liberties in this sort of like data-driven project, never having actually visited the Solomon Islands, as you mentioned in your essay. So yeah, maybe we can also speak a bit about the map that's in this image, because I think it's a really, I love the way that you contextualized this sculpture in the exhibition, and I'd love to kind of speak a bit about, where someone might have encountered this map.
Yes, thank you. We wanted and typically in an art exhibition, you don't get all of this context. In fact, the map is bigger than the sculpture. We were using it as an illustration. The main artwork is Hoffman's piece, but we didn't want people to simply look at it. We wanted them to understand the context and the consequence of it existing in the world. I think that might be one of the questions you could apply to any work, right? What is the consequence of this work? What is it doing? How does it change the way people think? So I think I have a close-up of the map. If we go maybe 2 slides forward, there it is. So these sculptures by Hoffman were photographed, and it's really hard to look at the map and understand that you're looking at sculptures. Some of these have bases, but if you're just looking at the faces, you start to think, maybe I'm looking at documentary photography instead of an artist's rendering. And so the map tells us a few things. We see her sculpture, the allegory of the races of the world on the top in that cameo, which shows, this crazy idea of the whole world breaking down into 3 principal races. And we also used this map because we wanted to emphasize to people that these sculptures and that map, they existed for decades. And this was produced by an atlas and map company that worked with educational institutions. And so some of you might recall like a classroom where a map would roll down in front of the blackboard when we still had those. And this is among the kinds of maps that would populate those classrooms and communicating quite directly these visual messages about racialization to growing generations.
On a final note on Hoffman before we move on to the next artist, this conversation really does make me think about, especially, when it comes to encyclopedic museums like the British Museum or the Met, how many objects have really yet to be unpacked and recontextualized and decolonialized, in the way that you've done with this exhibition. So, I think it's an exercise that we can all practice as we, continue to attend these institutions, really asking the questions, like how did this work come to get here? What, who made it, and what were maybe they motivated by at the time it was made. And, as you said, the exhibition, in making the decision to structure it thematically rather than chronologically, some of the artists in the exhibition that you've, put together actually have that conversation amongst themselves. So maybe we can move on to Sanford Biggers, who's the next artist that we're going to discuss. Just one more slide.
Yes. Just to pause for a second, this is kind of an important chapter in that Hoffman story. Again, these are some of the didactic materials we included to provide context for understanding the consequences of that sculpture, the whole edition. And this letter of protest in 1969, which really asked the Field Museum to stop authorizing the publication of that atlas, but also to change the display. But yes, you mentioned Sanford Biggers, so let's see. Oh, and here's just an overview shot of how you would have encountered some of these sculptures in the exhibition.
Yeah,
this is where you would encounter Sanford Biggers.
Yeah. And I love that kind of using or working with contemporary artists and including works by contemporary artists to really open up dialogues with more historical works in the exhibition. So yeah, I'd love for you to talk a bit about, your decision to present Bigger's 2020 work alongside Power's 1866 marble bust, and, speak to the tensions, but also, the way the histories of those works are intertwined.
Right. So as you like approach Sanford Bigger's Lady Interbellum, which is this massive work sitting on a shipping pallet, which is part of the sculpture. The artist created that to accompany the marble. And I think if we go to the next slide, we get drawn a little bit closer in. Thank you. You can see that this is a sculpture on the left that sort of immediately difficult to register. There's this really like notable glitchy thing happening in the figure's knee, not the one closest to us, but the one that's sort of in the background. And even the foot sort of becomes this webbed thing. And Biggers calls this part of his Chimera series. This one is called Lady Interbellum, so the lady between the wars. But the series, the Chimera, is referencing the classical Greek and the idea of a monster, usually a female monster, who's usually a hybrid, right? Two things that don't quite go together, can't quite exist. And he says this series in his work is about monsters of history. And it's really a critique on the whole enterprise, I think, of museums and collecting and global exploration. And so it's also really interesting how he uses marble, which is a material that's so deeply associated with Greco-Roman history, antiquities, things that get excavated in the 19th century, especially like Pompeii. But he's using contemporary technique of 3D scanning and 3D routing to cut the marble mechanically. So there's this very like modern riff on something old. But what he's done is he's 3D scanned two distinct works and hybridized them really impossibly. And so the lower part of this is a crouching Venus that's in a royal collection, I think, in the UK. And the head is a Fang, a Biri mask made by Fang people in Africa as part of ancestral veneration. And I think Biggers is asking us, what ends up in a so-called fine art collection? What ends up in an ethnographic collection? What is anthropology? How do we care for objects that come to us from other places, other times? How did they get there? The whole shipping pallet thing is like maybe a reference to many centuries of voracious collecting. And set in this part of the exhibition, it's surrounded by white marble sculptures that are from the 19th century. Two of them are by Hiram Powers. The work on the left and the back is the Greek slave, possibly one of the most famous sculptures of the 19th century. And on the right is Hiram Powers' Hope. So, I think one of the overriding questions in this exhibition that, again, goes back to Art Hum and Winkelmann, that 18th century philosopher, positing all kinds of hierarchies in ideas about whiteness, ideas about the whiteness of marble, the racial whiteness of subjects. 19th century American artists were absolutely smitten with the neoclassical contemporary world in Italy, where many of them went to look for models, marble, professional carvers to help them make their pieces. But they're also influenced by people like Winkelmann and the so-called Enlightenment and these ideas about power and ages of expansion and conquest and human slave trafficking. And so all of these values, these value systems, in a way, are embodied and create a mentality where you can end up with the idea of faith, hope, and charity, right? Something totally abstract being set to reside or be embodied by an idealized, youthful figure of a racially white woman, as we see in Power's Hope on the right. And so, there's this kind of collapse, maybe, of what's happening through the marble when you see Sanford Bigger's Lady Antebellum in this context.
Yeah, there's definitely like a collapse of time, of geography. And I even think that it's really, in dialogue with what we were discussing with Hoffman, which is, by nature a very reductive work. This one is additive, it's hybridized. And through that, Biggers is really demonstrating, how contemporary artists are thinking through and arming us with the visual tools for, this type of critique, contending with the histories that you've beautifully explained, from classicism to primitivism to ethnography. And it's not necessarily a simple answer. It's very, it's an artistic meditation, and I think that kind of that is the power of sculpture. There is to kind of open up for discussion. And really, yeah, I think it speaks volumes to the exhibition as well, to be able to create, in survey shows where so much is to be covered, that there's so much, depth to the individual works of the, 70 plus artists you included.
Yeah, it's if a painting says 1,000 words, what does a three-dimensional sculpture say?
I like that. That's a good one.
I think we have a few more views of just because it is in the round, wanted to be able to show what it's like to walk around this sculpture, to sort of be standing in relation to it. And that's another work by Hiram Powers, in the background, that tall figure on a plaster pedestal. It was like, it's not shown in its finished state, it's in its plaster, but it's standing in for a marble that was destined for the US Capitol. So, again, it's the kind of thing that Biggers is responding to, this kind of archetype of marbles, that all of America could somehow reside in this ideal figure.
So I think the next 4 artists that we're going to discuss actually play with this kind of expanded view of materiality. Is, the exhibition wasn't limited to marble or bronze by any means. And so, I'd love to speak a bit about this sort of dialogue you've created here, between Perkins and Noguchi. Of course, Noguchi is using plastic in the sculpture, so I think that's also an interesting kind of counterpoint to what we've been discussing. But yeah, maybe you could speak a bit about this sort of themes of solidarity that the exhibition really touched on.
Yes, I mean, it's so incredible to think, sculpture could be so many things. And we realized when we were building the exhibition too, the last major survey of American sculpture, the one that people usually refer to, was by Wayne Craven. And it was published first in 1968 and then reprinted in 1984. And there's really no other discipline, I think, academic discipline, where you're still kind of holding fast or relying upon, out of the absence of other things, volumes that were published generations ago. And so, part of what we wanted to do was try to think about artists that maybe were missing from the roster, and to think too about materials that aren't bronze and aren't marble. And so that's really applicable in these 2 artists, because here we show Noguchi working with plastic. It's 1943. Plastic is not a common material. It's pretty radical, pretty experimental, and it's plastic, I think, on top of plaster. I forget if it's hydrocal or plaster, but Noguchi is born in LA, and he is raised in the US, and then for a time in his youth returns to Japan, the place of his father's birth. But as a Japanese American on the East Coast during World War II, he elects to go to the West Coast because he somehow, as an idealized mind artist, thinks that he could do something in what we know are the internment camps, where Japanese American families are incarcerated. And Noguchi goes with all these ideas about, building orchards and kind of, art lessons and very utopian ideas, and quickly finds out that's not at all what this place is about. And so he eventually, after 7 months, finds a way to escape. But back in New York in his studio, he's thinking about my Arizona. And so this piece, I think, calls into mind the idea of surveillance, maybe a bird's eye view. It's this kind of, radioactive heat of the desert, but also maybe foreshadowing. I mean, we wouldn't know it in 1943, but the coming of atomic energy that is so devastating in its application in the bomb. And that sort of, shifts us over to Marion Perkins, who's an African-American artist on the south side of Chicago, and makes a series of sculptures, actually, the Sky Watchers, where he is reflecting in sculpture the words that are appearing in the Black press, where authors like Langston Hughes are holding the United States accountable for dropping the atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and using sculpture as a call out for interracial solidarity. And so this Sky Watcher, very uncomfortably, anatomically impossible, staring at the sky, sitting sentinel and watching what atrocity, what injustice will come next. And Perkins too is not using that perfect flawless marble that's quarried out of the quarries in Carrara, Italy. He's using found marble, usually architectural salvage from the streets of Chicago, where he was also a postal worker and knew every inch of the city and knew which buildings were slated for demolition. So really creative approaches as both of these artists are thinking about how to communicate protest in sculpture.
Yeah, that question of materiality and using, building debris as a way of, making these sculptures is such an interesting part of Perkins' practice that I hadn't yet been aware of. Something I do want to speak to as well is, when we think about sculpture, scale always comes into play. And so, your introduction, of course, touched on this, from monumental to sort of pocket size. But I'd love to speak about, how Perkins is, the reception of this work might have differed had it been realized as a public memorial.
Oh, yes. Well, Perkins, he wanted for the series, the monuments, to be realized in monumental form only after sort of the end of the threat of nuclear disasters and militarized applications of nuclear power, which we still don't have. So they were never realized. These are, I mean, one of the really interesting things about artists in general is their capacity to visualize and create a physical representation that gestures to a world that does not yet exist. That futurity is something we talked about a lot with the artists, and there were some works in the show. But I think at every given moment, right, something becomes historical, but in its contemporary moment, so often the artists are, from their point of view in their time, thinking about futurity.
Yeah, this work, sits beautifully in that tension too, with the figure kind of looking behind, but also, the legs outstretched ahead. And there is this kind of feeling of being both in the, past and potentially present, or, future with this work.
Yes.
Okay, I guess we'll move on to the final kind of comparison. I think probably my favorite, Sonia Clark and Maggie Thompson. So, you mentioned this briefly, but I think something that I find really interesting about the works you included is that, they do enter the realm of abstraction. So even considering this sort of discourse around race in American sculpture, it doesn't limit those sculptures to being figurative. And it really asks this question of how can actually the decision to keep the figure absent, how are artists thinking through this question of maybe working outside of the sort of representational violence of racial classification that often works get kind of stuck in or only seen through. So maybe you can share a bit about Clark and Thompson and the two works you kind of had on opposite sides of the gallery walls.
Yes, thank you. So that these works, as you just saw, appeared in a gallery where it was, really quieter. We had to lower the lights too, because these are fiber works. So, we're thinking too about materials, but there's also the necessity of lower light levels when you have fibers and the colors that could be fugitive or less stable. And what ended up happening is this like really contemplative space where you have two artists who are working in abstraction, and yet they are very, very specifically referencing legal histories that are constructed through oppositional logics. So Sonia Clark's octoroon is using a term, a historical term that defined a person who was identified as possessing 1/8 African or African American ancestry. And through that definition, before emancipation, this meant grounds for enslavement, or risk of being enslaved, and subsequently it meant subject to Jim Crow laws. And so this is like a visualization of something that's even more abstract, visualization of a law or of a legal history. The so-called one-drop rule, where there was the term octoroon, but there were many other terms. And the fundamental idea is that just one drop was enough to define you, and as African American. But Sonia is also celebrating hair, and she's using fibers, but she braids into cornrows 1/8 of this mass of hanging thread. And just that small, isolated 1/8 of the field is enough for us to visualize the American flag. And so I love this like shift from something that's fully abstract. If it were just like the fiber hanging, it would just be like a wall of beautiful fiber. But then the cornrows, now it's like emerged and you can't unsee it, right? That's the flag. And so it's also thinking about care, self-care, care and community, braiding someone else's hair, sitting to have your hair braided, and to the labor of African-American labor as fundamental, so braided into the history of the country that it is the American flag in Sonia's work. And then by contrast, there's, I was talking about oppositional logics. Maggie Thompson is referencing blood quantum. And, I have a quote that Maggie that really sums it up. She talks about, quote, "Even though I am mostly white, quote unquote, I still identify myself as being Native American." And she creates this family portrait with a visual directness that is showing how complex and flawed this system of racial identity is. And here she goes on to explain, quote, "You have to be 1/4 Native to be enrolled." And she's talking about Fondolaka Ojibwe. Her father is represented through the panel on the left. And so if I were to have children with a non-native man, then my kids would be ineligible to enroll in the tribe. So it makes the numbers kind of dwindle. And then there's that disconnection that brings on the whole a lot of emotional struggle. Yes, I may be able to raise them in the community, but that connection to the tribe is also really important. And so Maggie appears in the middle. And then her mother, who is of European white descent, is on the right in that right panel. And so, this kind of schematization of the concept of blood quantum and how it's structured to be in a state of precarity, depending on who marries whom.
Yeah, it's interesting how these works being, of course, abstracted, even still to me feel the most bodily, with direct references to human hair, to blood, and particularly with Clark, this thinking through these kind of operating signs. We have, hair as this kind of index for, for human presence. Simultaneously, it's operating alongside this sort of iconographic symbol, this, kind of symbolic sign for the US. So it's really thinking through that tension. I think we have just a couple minutes left, so we'll have to shift gears toward the audience Q&A. And I do have one question that I'd love to ask. For those of who are listening who may be interested in pursuing a career in the arts, maybe Karen, you can kind of speak to your time at the Smithsonian, and now more than ever, I really do believe that we need defenders of the arts and humanities and our history. So do you have any thoughts or advice you can give?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a big question. I often spend time thinking, how do you resist your algorithm? How do you escape the predictability of yourself, of a day? I was a bio major initially at Columbia, and it was a Russian literature class in English that I took for a whole year with an amazing professor that had me realize, wow, I want to major in art history. It was kind of like literature adjacent. So I think being able to experiment, to stretch within the art world too, I think really asking, what is the consequence of this being in the world? What does that same object look like when it's in a personal collection, when it's at an auction house, when it's in a private gallery, when it's in a museum, when it's juxtaposed, right? Just being able to think critically, but also to bring that criticality to yourself, right? And I think that we talked previously about canons and how they change, and how so much of this project of 82 works over almost 300 years, it's like thinking about multiple canons that coexist, or what gets elevated, why do we have a canon, and that canons are such a big part of how core curriculum had been built and how it's evolved over time. So I think things like Claudio Rankine's Citizen, which was a fairly recent addition to the curriculum at Columbia, that's something too that we referenced in our exhibition catalog. So I think trying to be fluid, and to just keep expanding what you're looking at.
Yeah, I think there's something special too, just working with, you were mentioning the kind of like future thinking that artists do and writers do. And there's something so rewarding, kind of surrounding your professional life with those ideas. It was really lovely speaking with you, Karen. I think let's welcome Riley back, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. This was such a great conversation. Thank you to Nicole and to Karen. for this very deeply insightful conversation and for sharing your expertise with the community. And a big thank you to all of the alumni, students, and friends in attendance. You submitted some great questions, and we're glad we got to most of them. I'm taking with me Marion Perkins. I'm a Chicago Southsider, so I'm going to take that with me and do some more reading about him. So up next, tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have a mini core lecture, Life in the Universe, at the Alumni Center. Professor Nicholas Luber explores whether we're alone in the cosmos through an interdisciplinary tour of astronomy, biology, and planetary science, from exoplanets to the origins of life and the prospects for finding it elsewhere. On Monday, November 17th, we will have Cafe Columbia, Art, Truth, and the Fragility of the Polis. Professor Geronimo Duarte Riascos revisits Plato's critique of art by looking at contemporary works that deliberately deceive and consider why art's power can unsettle politics and the polis, also in the Alumni Center. All these events and more are listed on our website at www.college.edu/alumni/events. And please stay connected. We love to keep the momentum going. Join upcoming programs, invite a classmate, or just volunteer your time and expertise. And if you'd like to get more involved, please reach out to us at ccalumni@columbia.edu. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. Talk to you soon.